Hello and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and joining me here in the Murrieta studios is Dr. David Burns. Hi, David.
Hi, Fabrice.
Dr. David Burns has been a pioneer in the development of cognitive therapy, and he is the creator of the new team therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 20 languages. He is an emeritus adjunct clinical professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Welcome to episode 41 of the Feeling Good podcast. And today we are going to talk about the third uncovering technique, the WhatIf technique. So David, what differentiates this technique from the other two that we've looked at, especially from the individual downward arrow?
Yeah, the three downward arrow techniques are the individual downward arrow, the interpersonal downward arrow, and the WhatIf technique. And in the two previous podcasts, we covered the individual downward arrow, and the goal there is to get to these self-esteem equations, the individual self-defeating beliefs like perfectionism, achievement addiction, approval addiction, and things of that nature.
Yeah.
In the interpersonal downward arrow, you get at the way people set up relationships, the expectations that we have.
Yeah,
that
rules.
Yeah, the rules of relationships that can lead to either conflicted, problematic relationships or loving, joyous ones. In the WhatIf technique, we're trying to uncover a core feared fantasy that's underneath someone's anxiety disorder. So in all three of these, we're going for the deeper structures in the brain or in the psyche. But in the WhatIf technique is specifically designed for anxiety disorders. I created the first two individual and interpersonal downward arrow techniques. And then Albert Ellis, the noted and somewhat notorious amazing but controversial late psychologist from New York City. I believe he was the creator of the WhatIf technique.
I think he was only controversial because he used a lot of curse words and he was unwavering in his confidence.
Exactly.
That's what happens,
Right.
People don't like that.
Right. Well, some people do. Your followers do, and
Yeah.
people that don't like you kind of get polarized against you when you take a real extreme position. But he made a lot of tremendous contributions, but was a extremely colorful figure. I happen to like him and admire him.
Yeah,
a lot.
I like him too. I mean, I think he's the first one I discovered in the cognitive behavioral therapy field. And I really took a liking to the guy in spite of his curmudgeonness.
Well, the thing is, he was honest. He had integrity and didn't try to steal from other people and call it his own. And that was one of the things I really, really loved about him.
Yeah. So the WhatIf technique.
Should we dive in? You were also making a comment before we started how if you're a therapist listening, or I suppose a general citizen type as well, that you were saying sometimes you'll start with one technique and then veer off into a different one.
I wanted to wait until you kind of explained it a little bit to interject that. Yeah, but we'll get to that.
Okay, super. Well, the WhatIf technique, I've got a great vignette to illustrate it, plus some neat PowerPoint presentation, and I have a new tool now. I can embed PowerPoints right into.
I know that's quite nifty. I saw that. Yeah,
right into our show notes.
You may want to add a PDF for people who, for some reason, cannot view that. I don't know if everyone has the technology. Yeah.
Oh, I see. Yeah, sure. I can.
Sure.
I can do that as well. Now, in the WhatIf technique and any of these three downward arrow techniques, you always start with the thought. From a daily mood log, and then you say to the patient or the client, whatever word you use, or to yourself if you're doing it yourself, but you draw a downward arrow underneath the negative thought, and you say, if this were true, what's the worst that could happen? What are you the most afraid of?
Yeah.
And then whatever the client says, you say, write that down, and we'll illustrate this here in just a moment, put a new downward arrow under it, and then if that were true? What's the worst that could happen? What are you the most afraid of? And so we get at increasingly, frightening fantasies until you get to this core fantasy that's at the root of your fears.
And so really so far the difference is you use a different question. You start the same way if this were true, but instead of saying, what would that mean to you? What would that be upsetting? You would say, what is the worst that could happen? What are you afraid of?
Yeah, exactly. In fact, in workshops, I sometimes give a humorous example, like you might have the fear in a workshop, if I get up and do a role play with David, I might make a fool of myself.
Yeah.
And then, if that were true, what would happen? What are you the most afraid of? Well, then people in the audience will judge me and dislike me. And well, I suppose that happened. What are you the most afraid of? Well, they'll all tell other people. After the workshop.
There's the brush fire fallacy.
The brush fire fallacy. So tell people what a loser I am, and I'm an inept therapist, and say, well, suppose each one tells 5 others, then what are you afraid of? Well, then they'll each tell 5 others, and this thing will spread like brush fire. And so by the next morning, say I'm speaking in Philadelphia, there's a headline in the Philadelphia newspaper, therapist blows it in workshop, thousands flee in terror, lives destroyed, this type of thing.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what you're trying to get at, that core fantasy that's fueling your fears.
I think the existentialists would say that at the bottom of all this, there's always a fear of death.
Well, actually, that's the famous Stanford psychiatrist. I'm trying to think of his...
Yalom?
He made that claim. I would say, in my experience, that's virtually never true.
Tell me why. Interesting, yeah.
Well, the only people in my practice who ever were afraid of death were people with panic attacks who had the thought, I'm about to have a heart attack and die. But aside from that, this claim that Yalom has made, I've had over 35,000 therapy sessions with anxious individuals, and aside from the few with panic attacks, and we've talked, that's one of the easiest, fastest things to treat in all of psychiatry. I think we've given an example of that in an earlier podcast. But aside from those few patients who had the fear of death, I've never seen it in anyone else. And we're going to have...
I've had some patients really say that, no, then I'm going to die. So that has happened to me.
Well, we had that podcast on how to overcome that fear, right?
Yeah, that's right.
It's a pretty easy one to treat.
Often this what-if technique goes down to very survival level issues, like I'm going to be homeless.
Yes.
I'm
yes.
I've
had
broke,
that in a lot.
I'm going to starve.
I'll be begging on the street, and that my career will be ruined.
Yeah.
Oh yes, I see that a lot. I used to see that a lot with attorneys I would treat. They all seem to have this fear they were going to blow a case in court, and then they'll go bankrupt, and then their loved ones will leave them, and then they're begging, on the streets of San Francisco with a tin cup for survival.
In a way, this may not exactly be the fear of death, but it's the fear of life in a degraded mode.
Yes, yeah, that's a cool way of looking at it. Well, I've got a great vignette, and like always, I'll disguise the identity of
as we always do.
Yeah, but this was a really lovely woman from San Francisco who came to me with more than a decade of, I would say, mild to moderate depression, but severe agoraphobia. And she came from a famous, wealthy San Francisco family and was living in downtown San Francisco with her 2 sons. She was divorced. They were about, 9 and 11 years old or something in that range. And I wanted to find out, what was behind her agoraphobia. She was afraid to leave home alone without a trusted friend or companion. That's pretty much the definition of agoraphobia. And so, since thoughts cause all of our positive and negative emotions, I said, suppose you left your apartment, you said there's a grocery store 3 blocks away and you walked to the grocery store. What are you afraid of? What's the worst that could happen? And the thought she had was, and you can watch this on the PowerPoints. Let me see if I can get this working here. She said, I might drop my handkerchief. And so I'll be the patient, and you can be my shrink. And so I asked her to write it down and draw a downward arrow under it. And then you asked the downward arrow question.
So you might drop your handkerchief. And let's assume that happened. What are you the most afraid of? What is the worst that could happen then?
Well, a murder might be committed right on the spot where I drop my handkerchief, and we should say that we're not laughing at this woman.
No, we're not laughing at the patient, sorry.
But sometimes when you look at a different perspective, our fears are...
I know, so let's keep our composure, and let's assume that happened. What are you the most afraid of? What's the worst that could happen?
Oh, well, then the police might find the handkerchief and think that I did it, that I was the one who committed the murder.
Well, let's assume that happened, and then what's the worst that could happen?
Well, I'd end up in prison for life.
Okay, and let's assume that happened. What are you the most afraid of? What's the worst that could happen?
There was a long pause, and she started to get tearful, and then she said, well, then my sons would grow up without their mother. Now, when somebody, and this is kind of her root fear, now when someone gets tearful, I like to kind of empathize and put the tool on the shelf temporarily and find out what's going on.
So
and I said,
what did you say to her?
Well, I said, it sounds like there's something about your sons growing up without their mother, that is there some issue with your sons, that you're concerned about your sons? It's kind of a hidden emotion type of
a little bit, yeah.
And then she said, well, her sons were in public school, and they were troublemakers, and they were flunking their classes, and so she put them in a very expensive private school, but the same thing was happening. She said that she and her husband, they're divorced, and they have these acrimonious arguments on the telephone about what's the best way to raise the kids. And one says they need more love, the other says they need more discipline. So the kids are getting caught up in this battle between the two of them. And she said that somebody in their neighborhood had been throwing stones at people's windows, breaking windows and causing problems, and so there were a lot of complaints to the local police, and so they kind of put out a dragnet to try to catch whoever was doing this vandalism. Yeah. And one night, she said, just last week, the police came, knocked on her door, and they had found the culprits, and they had her 2 sons there. Yeah. And told her that if this didn't stop, they'd have to arrest them and maybe put them in foster care, or go to juvenile hall.
Yeah, right, yeah.
And this was very, very disturbing to her. Now, Freud had this concept. I'm not too over the top enthusiast for Freud, but he did have some good stuff, and he had this thing he called the masochistic solution. And the masochistic solution is that you're allowed to punish the people you love. You can be angry with them and punish them if you punish yourself more. Ah. And I was thinking,
this will hurt me more than it will hurt you, right?
Yeah, so you kind of hide your motive that way, you see. And you can see here that here was this very nice woman who was probably secretly angry with her kids, with her boys. But being a very nice person, as she was, she feels she's not allowed to be angry with anybody, so she sweeps it under the carpet. Mm-hmm. But notice,
I heard you say once that anxious people are always nice people.
Oh yeah, and we'll get into that more in the next broadcast when we'll talk more about this hidden emotion model and technique. But you notice here that she goes to prison for life. So she's being punished in this fantasy. But do you notice that she's rejecting her boys? See, my boys would grow up without their mother. So in her fantasy, she's punishing them.
But it's a fantasy that she doesn't want.
Oh, right. But it's the fantasy at the root of her anxiety, and it's the fantasy of punishing her boys, but she hides her anger by punishing herself more in this fantasy.
Right.
You see?
Wow.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
That's my speculation, but I can't guarantee it's 100% true. But I talked with her about the fact that maybe in addition to working on your agoraphobia and confronting this fear, maybe you would need some help dealing with your sons. And maybe, I'm not sure I'm the greatest expert in the world, but I think I could help you develop more of a tough love kind of program for them if you wanted, so you'd have a systematic way of shaping their behavior. And in addition, if you implemented this with the support of your ex-husband, I have no doubt it would be effective, but then you'd have to learn to develop a better relationship with him.
Right.
And I can show you how to do that using the 5 secrets of effective communication. But if you didn't want to, I would totally accept that and understand that. And because most divorced people do like to kind of fight and blame each other and aren't looking for a better relationship. Yeah. But she bought it. And I taught her the 5 secrets, and she, instead of arguing and putting her husband down all the time, she began to use the disarming technique and stroking and empathy and inquiry. And he ate it up and was kind of eating out of her hand pretty quickly.
Right.
And together they developed a kind of a tough love program to discipline the kids. And it worked rapidly, and she got a call from school that the boys' behavior had radically changed. And in fact, one of her sons became elected the class president, which was a shock.
Absolutely,
And at that point, her depression went away, but she still had this agoraphobia. And so once you have this root fear, then you've got to confront the fear once you reveal it with the WhatIf technique.
Right.
The technique I used was flooding, which is just the most extreme form of exposure. And I told her for her homework, there was a park. I think, Golden Gate Park was just, a number of blocks from where she lived, and she knew of a particular park bench there. And I said, I want you to go on a Saturday morning to Golden Gate Park, and no matter how anxious you get, you're not allowed to flee and run home.
Right.
But you can write down your anxiety, bring a clipboard or something, and put every minute how anxious you are from 0 to 100 and what fantasies you're having that are terrifying you. So she was a good egg, and she was really determined, and that's...
Did you ask her to drop her handkerchief, too?
No, I forgot to do that. That would have been a good one. Bring 10 handkerchiefs and drop them, leave a trail of handkerchiefs. She was quite wealthy and would have been able to do that. But at any rate, so she gets out, she starts walking toward this bench at the park, and she's 95% anxious, and she wants to run home because she's just sure that she's going to get arrested for some crime she didn't commit.
Right.
So, but she remembers her commitment. I told her if you can't stand the anxiety, you can bring a little, like a Rubik's Cube or something, a toy, to distract yourself. Yeah. And that's another technique, distraction. It's my least favorite of the 50 techniques I teach my students.
It takes a little bit away from the exercise itself.
Right, but I wanted to give her some kind of an escape valve so she wouldn't run home.
So she wouldn't run home, exactly, yeah.
So she went and sat on this park bench, and she's 95% anxious and struggling with this urge to run home, and she's just sure she's about to get arrested. And then she saw this police officer about maybe 50 yards away, and now her anxiety is going up to toward 96%, 97%, and she's trying to sit motionless like a statue. hoping that he won't notice her. But she's peeking out of the corner of her eye, and instead of walking away, he turns right toward her and starts walking right toward her.
It's like, oh my God.
Yeah, exactly. So now her anxiety is up at 100%, and she wants to run and try to get away from him, but she remembers her commitment, so she pulls out this Rubik's Cube, and she's sitting there and staring at it, and all of a sudden she sees two black shoes right in front of her, and she realizes that it's the policeman and that he's there to arrest her. And so she holds her hands up in the air like this. Okay, you can put the handcuffs on. And I won't protest. And then she recognizes this Irish cop who she's known ever since she was a little girl, Officer O'Reilly.
Yeah.
And he says, "Oh, top of the morning to you, Kristen. So great to see you here out and about on a Saturday morning. Isn't it a beautiful day we're having here in Golden Gate Park?" And she can't believe that he's not arresting her, and she says her anxiety went from 100 to 0 like in a second. Mm-hmm. And she jumped up off of the park bench, and she had a wonderful conversation with him. She was all animated and excited, and then he went on his beat. And then she took the cable car, went downtown. She went to museums. She went to boutiques. She did all the things for 5 hours that she had been unable to do for the previous 12 years. And so that's an illustration not only of the what-if technique, but also flooding, extreme exposure. Yeah. Response prevention too. I told her you're not allowed to do your normal thing of running away.
Right, exactly.
Plus the hidden emotion technique, as well as some 5 secrets of effective communication and some problem solving to address the problem with her children. So this was a person where a number of techniques coalesced together that all worked together for her recovery.
Yeah, it's good that you're talking about this, because a lot of people may wonder, so once we have uncovered, what do we do with it? And when it comes to fears, the exposure is often the go-to method. And I went to a conference a few weeks ago where there was a research paper that was presented where they had studied the exposure methods, and one thing they found was that in exposure, it doesn't seem to be necessary for the fear to go down to 0 or even to a low value during the exposure. What is necessary is that the patient be exposed to a contradiction between their fear and what's really happening in reality.
Oh yeah, right.
So there's like this cognitive dissonance that creates some resolution.
Yeah, and we can talk about that more when we talk about exposure. You can set the exposure up as an experiment to test a patient's belief.
Yeah.
For example, I had a woman who approached me after a workshop I was doing in Denver on anxiety disorders, and I'd asked for a live volunteer, and she was afraid to volunteer for the live demonstration. But at the end, I was packing up my these were days when I used overheads rather than the PowerPoint projection. I was organizing them and packing them up, and she came up and said, by the way, I've been in psychoanalysis for 25 years for my elevator phobia.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to ask, I wanted to volunteer for the live demonstration, but I don't know, how much longer do you think it would take to overcome my elevator phobia? She asked me, when you treat people, how long does this, treatment usually last?
Yeah.
And, how many more years should she endure this 5-day-a-week free association?
Right.
And I said, well, I can usually complete a course of treatment for an elevator phobia in about 7 to 10 minutes. And so if you'd like, I can just cure you right now while I'm packing up my overheads. And she said, well, how would you do that? And I said, oh, it's easy. There's an elevator right over there. There's four stories up and down. You just get on there and stay on there until you're cured, and I'll just wait for you here. I'll finish packing up my stuff, and then when you're cured, you can come on back. And then she said, oh, no, that I could never do that. You'd have to get with me on the elevator. And I said, oh, no, that's no good, because then you won't be frightened. You've got to get on there and freak out. And she says, well, please, if you come with me, I promise I'll freak out, even if you're with me. I said, yeah, but you'll be too reassured if I'm with you. You've got to confront the fear. She says, oh no, it'll be just as bad if you're with me. And so I said, okay, I'll come on with you, but what are you afraid of that's going to happen? And she said, well, and this comes to your point about this contradiction. She said, I'm afraid the walls will close in and the air will disappear.
I had a patient say exactly the same thing to me, yeah.
Oh, yeah, because you did one just recently.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm eager to find out how that worked. So I'll make my story quick. So we got on the elevator, and she's like 95% anxious, and I said, well, you promised me you'd freak out, and I wanted 100, not 95. And most therapists try to control the anxiety. I always do the opposite. The attempt to control the anxiety is the cause of the anxiety. And so I said, let's freak out. Put your hands here on the walls. I think I can feel them moving now, and we're probably going to get crushed. And she put her hands in the elevator, starting to go up toward the second floor. She said, well, they don't seem to be moving. And I said, well, take a deep breath. I think the oxygen is disappearing. You'll probably not be able to take a deep breath. And then she said, there seems to be plenty of oxygen in here. And we're up to about the third floor, heading to the fourth. And I said, how anxious are you? She says, Dr. Burns, I'm so apologetic. Bad news. I said, what's that? She said, my anxiety is just zero. This thing is just ridiculous. I don't have an elevator phobia anymore. And that's combining a cognitive technique with the exposure, that we're testing the thoughts during the exposure. So it's a little different way of using exposure, and to my way of thinking, a more powerful one. And one of the academic arguments that people have is that the exposure per se, or the discovery during the exposure that your negative thought is not true, because the necessary and sufficient condition for emotional change is that let's say the sufficient condition, to take a page out of your book, is that the patient no longer believes the negative thought. And the moment the patient doesn't believe the negative thought, the symptoms will typically disappear.
Right. Yeah. It's that they seem to say that this had to do with memory reconsolidation. When we remember something, we transform it. And when you put it back, it's like it's changed. And so if you reconsolidate in a way that's totally contradictory, this seems to be therapeutic. I have a question. So, as I mentioned before, I use the WhatIf technique in my practice, and I also use the individual downward arrow.
Oh, good.
And
do you like them?
I do. Yes.
Good, cool.
I mean, it's some of my favorite techniques because it goes from the surface down to something deeper. But what I find is that when I do the individual downward arrow, people will sometimes come up with fears.
Yeah.
And I often switch and say, well, what if this were true? What is the worst that could happen? What are you afraid of? And so I kind of switch between the downward arrow and the WhatIf technique. Am I doing things wrong, doctor?
No, that's the way you should do it. These are fluid techniques. They're not sticks or rigid, stiff protocols. I've seen it go in the other direction too. I had a patient who was afraid to criticize me, and he'd give me low marks on empathy, but he would never say anything negative. I'd say, it sounds like you're a little turned off, and he'd say, oh, the therapy's good, the techniques are wonderful, and he would change the subject. And so I asked him, I started out with the WhatIf technique, and said, well, let's say that you did finally agree to criticize me. what are you afraid of? What's the worst that could happen? And he said right away, well, then you'll get upset and reject me.
Yeah.
And I won't be able to work with you anymore. And then I said, oh, my goodness, this sounds like an interpersonal downward arrow.
Uh-huh.
So then I said, well, let's say that happened. What would that tell you about the kind of guy I am?
Right.
And, well, that would mean Burns is fragile and narcissistic and mean and dangerous and powerful.
Oh, you had a very accurate view.
Exactly. And then what would be your role in the relationship? Well, his role is to be submissive and weak and
right.
hide his feelings. And then what are the rules of the relationship? Well, the rule to relate to me has to be always agreeing with me and doing what I ask him to do and never sharing his negative feelings and always being polite and submissive and so forth. And that was, of course, the root of all of his problems, because he came not only for horrific depression but for severe social anxiety.
Right.
He every time he in particular, he was afraid to eat with people, especially women he was attracted to, for fear he'd start vomiting all over them.
Yeah.
And so then after this system came out with the interpersonal downward arrow, then again, I wanted him to confront his fear. And I really told him that he really had to criticize me, that the time has come. And then he criticized me, and I complimented on him. I stroked him. I gave him really warm, congratulations for having done that. And he opened right up and began to say all the things he'd been afraid to say. And we had the greatest session ever. And he came in a week later, to make a long story short, and he was completely free of all of his symptoms. He'd started eating in front of people and asking out attractive women and things of that nature. So when you're doing these techniques, any kind of uncovering technique, you then want to go in with techniques to help the person change it. On rare occasion, the insight as to what your core beliefs are that are getting you into trouble, maybe one patient in 10 or less, just the insight is enough to change them. But usually you have to use some powerful techniques to change those beliefs.
All right. Well, thank you. This is very useful, very interesting, and I wanted to also add that we did this series of 3 uncovering techniques, but there's other ways to uncover, but there's at least one fourth one that we haven't talked about. That's maybe a little bit different, and we've mentioned it in the past. And
today, actually.
And yeah, we haven't mentioned it today. That's right. The hidden emotion.
Yeah.
And this won't be part of this series, but this will come up in the next series of podcasts we're going to do on OCD, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So people stay tuned, and there's more fun to be had.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this podcast under the blog page, and where you can leave your comments and questions. The website has an abundance of resources for therapists as well as non-therapists, including books, workshops, a list of online training groups around the world, and much more. Theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donsel. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.